So welcome to all. I'm Jeff Shanka, CEO of First Insurance Company of Hawaii. I'm here once again in partnership with and in support of our colleagues at the University of Hawaii at Manoa College of Social Sciences, led by Dean Denise Conan. I also want to thank the Hawaii Business Roundtable and of course the Chamber of Commerce for their support. As I often say these days, I wish we could have conducted this discussion in person with Dean Conan as moderator and facilitator. However, since in-person gatherings of that size are not yet deemed safe, we will need to settle for this virtual format. Frankly, both the Dean as well as the panelists have done a remarkable job so far. I expect to see more of that quality today. The purpose of this series of discussions is to explore the pandemic's effects on society beyond the usual metrics we are constantly hearing about. Of course, these common metrics include the number of infections, the test positivity rate, and unfortunately, the number we have lost to the COVID-19 virus. While these are important metrics, they do not begin to describe the broader impact on society. By funding this research conducted by professors, postdoctoral researchers, and other academic partners, our joint goal was to provide evidence-based social sciences research so that Hawaii's leaders can better understand the impact of the pandemic and then make informed and compassionate policy and business decisions. The issue of food insecurity is not unique. It's not a unique outcome of the pandemic, of course. Nevertheless, food insecurity among our more vulnerable populations has gotten worse because of COVID-19. So many school children depend on school lunch programs to meet much of their daily nutritional needs, and these needs are not being met with so many schools still operating remotely. This is only one example of food insecurity that has been impacted by the pandemic. Let's hope that by bringing the right stakeholders together and discussing the issues and potential solutions in a scientific, data-driven fashion, we can help decision makers make the best choice for the people that they serve. Again, thank you for your attendance and support. With that, turn it over to Dean Conan and her team. Denise, you have the floor. Thank you.
Mahalo. Thank you, Jeff. I am so excited to be here, and I really welcome everybody who joined today. We have, of course, the top leaders in the state are members of the Hawaii Business Roundtable, the Chamber of Commerce, also legislators and politicians, also special friends of the college and those directly involved in the food security activities, the NGOs and the like. And the people on this Zoom today are the kind of people that can really affect change in our community. We're so honored that you joined us here today. And I hope you do participate. We really do want you to ask questions and chat. We will have time for that. I want to especially also thank Jeff Shanka and First Insurance Company of Hawaii. And let me give you a little background on why we're working together like this. Jeff, in the early days of the emergence of the pandemic, when he started to see major impacts in our society, noticed that there was a lot of attention on economic outcomes, unemployment, tracking of and as he expressed, tracking of, cases, but that there were many, many untold stories of impacts on our community in a variety of ways. And so he reached out to me and asked, could our faculty, could our researchers get engaged in doing that kind of research that would impact decision-making? And let me be honest that usually our faculty are doing research that is building on earlier work, building on a literature, carefully done over the course of a long time, peer-reviewed, published, and that may take us a long time. But the call that Jeff gave to us was to come up with research that could be fast, that could be impactful and meaningful today or as soon as possible. And our faculty really stepped up with a lot of excitement about that. They also got together in multidisciplinary teams that don't necessarily work together often, but came together because it is important for Hawaii that we do so. And so we see this social sciences impact as a new series that we've launched with Jeff's support, his inspiration and financial support, so that we can do this kind of bold work, collaborative research that will also make a difference in Hawaii. We're really pleased to do so. So that's the purpose of our series. I do hope that you will meaningfully contribute to today's discussion by asking questions in the Q&A box and throughout the session, and we will turn to Q&A towards the end. Today's topic is such an important one on food insecurity and how we address these issues. You know, these issues are always with us, but especially now, and we do want to understand better what's really happening in our community today. And so with that, let me turn it over to our research team, and I'll let Jack introduce. Turning it over to Jack.
Hello, thank you, Dean Conan. I would like to introduce our presenters for the research team for today's webinar. Our presentations will be led by Dr. Wei Zhang of Department of Sociology and Dr. Anna Pruitt from the Department of Psychology. We will then open up the webinar for questions and answers with all the report co-authors. This will include Dr. Yang Wu of the Office of Public Health Studies, Dr. Brad Nakamura of the Department of Psychology, Omar Bird from the Department of Sociology, and myself. If you would like to ask a question, please just enter it in the question and answer box at any time during or after the presentation, and we will get to it. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Zhang to start our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Very good. So Anna and I today will be representing our team to do addressing Hawaii Business Roundtable and Chamber of Commerce of Hawaii. Thank you very much for sponsoring this event, make our research and presentation possible today. In today's presentation, we will be primarily cover 3 major issues. And first, we would like to offer the definition of food insecurity and who is impacted by food insecurity in Hawaii. Second, utilizing multidimensional data, we would like to investigate how has COVID-19 impacted family hunger and food insecurity in Hawaii. And based on our findings, finally, we would like to introduce a list of recommendations and discuss what can we do to address the food insecurity issues in Hawaii. First, what is food insecurity? Food insecurity is defined by the U.S. Department of Agriculture as low food or very low food security. Low food security referred to as reduced quality food, and very low food security refers to reduced food intake. And these 2 statuses are collectively termed as food insecurity. By comparison, food secure refers to having enough of the kinds of food needed to live a healthy, active life. Who is affected by food insecurity in the United States? Food insecurity in the US has disproportionately impacted families with children. And this is particularly the case after the pandemic began. So for instance, the percentage of food insecure families with children has doubled since March 2020. What does this look like in Hawaii? According to our statistics, it shows that the projected child food insecurity rate in Hawaii in 2018 is 18.4%. And this number increased all the way to 29.4% in 2020. And this makes Hawaii rank 6th in the United States for the highest projected rate of child food insecurity in 2020. So under these circumstances, our current investigation is seeking to answer three major questions. First, we would like to examine how has COVID-19 impacted family food insecurity in Hawaii, and discuss who is most impacted by food insecurity. Second, we would like to examine what local efforts exist to address these issues and how has COVID-19 impacted these efforts. Finally, we would like to discuss what can we do to best address these issues in Hawaii. To answer these questions, we utilizing data from multiple sources. First, we used bi-weekly survey data collected by US Census Bureau. And this data is called the Household Pulse Survey. We utilized multiple waves starting from last year's May all the way to this year's March. Second source of data are from interview data. We interviewed a total of 8 stakeholders to date. And finally, we also use archival data from state and local agencies. So here comes our findings. How has COVID-19 impacted family hunger and food insecurity in Hawaii? Our data analysis from Household Pulse Survey suggested that food insecurity for families with children in Hawaii has increased significantly since the pandemic began and has remained high into the year of 2021. For instance, the prevalence of the very low food security was between 11 to 16% since May 2020. In addition, our supplementary data analysis showed that the patterns of mental health problems for those families in Hawaii is consistent to the patterns of food insecurity in Hawaii, indicating the possible severe mental health consequences for those families and children who suffered from food insecurity during the pandemic. With regards to while food insecurity is on the rise nationwide, as indicated by this figure, we see that across the entire United States households, including those households having children and not having children, the percentage of experiencing certain levels of food insecurity is approximately 37%. So you add up 11% and 26%, reporting very low food security or low food security at the national level in the United States. In comparison, Hawaii has seen larger increase in food insecurity. And households reporting food insecurity is as high as 44% in February 2021. So adds up these two percentages, 44% for Hawaii, and significantly higher compared to the US national level. What about family with children? The most recent data from Hawaii's family, using the Household Pulse Survey, we found that currently 48% of families with children in Hawaii are experiencing a form of food insecurity. So almost half of the families with children, they are experiencing this difficulty. Finally, who is experiencing food insecurity in Hawaii? Our data analysis identified 3 vulnerable social groups. The first group is those low-income families. We see a substantial gap existing between those high-income family and low-income family. So as you can see, for those families making less than $50,000 a year of income, those families report as high as 20% of food insecurity for their children. By comparison, for those high-income families, the percentage is as low as 2%. In addition to that, we also identify those families with less education is also vulnerable. So for those families, their parental levels of education being bachelor's degree or higher, the percentage of children having food insecurity is 6% or below. But for those families with parental levels of education being high school and below, the percentage of food insecurity is as high as 20%. There is substantial gap over there. So finally, we also identify families who identify themselves as Black, multiracial, and Hispanic family, they're experiencing higher levels of food insecurity among their families. Now I would like to turn over to Anna to continue our presentation. And she will be present on the local efforts existing to deal with food insecurity. And she will also be introducing the barriers and other things. Thank you, Anna, it's all yours.
Okay, great, thank you, Wei. So we also looked at what local efforts exist to address this issue here in Hawaii, and in particular, how COVID-19 has impacted those efforts. So there's three main kind of approaches. First, benefits programs with programs like SNAP, or formerly known as food stamps, as well as prepared meal distributions. So this would include Meals on Wheels and free school meal programs. And then emergency solutions like food banks or food distributions. And what we found is that with COVID-19 has come an increased demand at all of these levels, and simultaneously a need to reconfigure the service model, in some cases quite substantially, to account for COVID safety protocols, as well as in the beginning of the pandemic to kind of adjust to state closures and to deal with the increase in demand. So benefits programs at the federal level, we saw an increase in eligibility for SNAP, an increase in the amount of benefits received, as well as a waiver of certain requirements, like in-person interviews that would help people be able to access these services during the pandemic. Also, there was the issuance of pandemic EBT cards. So these were available to families with children who qualified for free or reduced priced school meals. And we saw a substantial increase in SNAP recipients from 2019 to 2020. And if you look, what I think is interesting here is if you look at the 2019 number of SNAP recipients over the course of the year, it remains pretty flat. But if you look at the 2020 trend line, it's increasing, and you see two spikes after the first and second economic shutdown. So this suggests that it's not just the increase in eligibility that led to the increase in recipients, but an actual increase in need due to economic factors. Prepared meals also saw an increase in demand and a need to kind of readjust things. And perhaps this was most apparent with the school meals programs once schools had closed. So the DOE quickly switched to grab and go meals, which allowed for parents or guardians, or even in some cases, social workers or case managers to pick up meals and deliver them to families. And importantly, it made use of federal waivers that reduced certain requirements, like the area eligibility requirement. So any child was eligible regardless of need, regardless of what school they were enrolled in. They could pick up a meal at any of the grab and go sites. And a lot of meals, 1.3 million, just between March and July of last year were distributed. So despite this, this kind of shift to grab and go meals, not every school was able to be a grab and go site. And so what you see is that there were some gaps for families in rural areas. If there wasn't a grab and go site in their community, they had difficulty accessing sites in other communities and other areas. And so what happened in these instances is that local service agencies kind of stepped up and filled those gaps, but without additional resources in a lot of cases. Emergency solutions also, of course, saw increased demand, and the Hawaii Food Bank reported distributing 12 million pounds of food in 2019 and 19 million just from March to November of 2020. And one of the ways in which different food distributions and pantries kind of responded to this was collaborating with social service agencies to expand these sites to different areas across the state. And if you look at our survey data, you can see that food bank and other similar community programs were the most common source of free food for families with children in Hawaii. So some continuing challenges or issues that kind of come up in this area. Some of the people that we talked to who work in food distribution reported an increase in the number of families who were saying, I have never done this before, I don't know where to get help, and suggested that there were barriers related to stigma or lack of awareness of services that were keeping families from getting the services they qualified for. Additionally, despite all these expansions of services and distribution sites, most of them had to be closed upon the reopening of the economy in October, in part because those venues were then being used for business. And as was true before the pandemic, food banks and distribution in general are more inconsistent in rural areas, and that has continued throughout the pandemic. And finally, the difficulty that emerges when trying to use something that's meant to be an emergency solution. So these types of approaches are for families in immediate crisis, with the assumption that eventually there will be long-term solutions. And so when we're using emergency solutions to meet long-term needs, or we're using them during a long-term crisis, like COVID has turned out to be, it really puts a strain on this area of services. Additionally, despite the fact that we have seen a really impressive expansion of services, we see that need continues to outpace those services. So if you look at our survey data, of the families who were experiencing very low food security, so they didn't get enough to eat, only a little more than half was actually receiving any free food services as of March 1st, 2021. And the largest percentage of those received free food from families or friends, and not from any sort of formal service provider or program or benefits program. Also, if you look here, you can see that the food insecure households were slightly less likely than food secure families to receive free meals from school programs like the Grab and Go. So what this suggests to us is that the people who most need services are not able to get them. They are having the most trouble getting them. So why is that? And what are some of the barriers to receiving services? So lack of public awareness. A lot of families, particularly those who are new to food insecurity, are just unaware of what services exist. And if they are, they're unaware of how to go about accessing them. It is complicated to apply for benefits programs, and just lack of awareness and lack of knowledge of how to go through the system. And stigma adds an extra layer, feeling shame or embarrassment for needing assistance. And then from a programmatic and policy level, differing needs and context can make it difficult to determine what is going to be the most effective approach to this issue. So we know that families with different family structure in living in different communities, people who live in a rural area versus urban area, there's just different barriers. And even the barriers that might be the same, they look different, right? So one example is transportation. That was a barrier cited by everyone we talked to. And it might look different depending on what community you're in, right? So one example of a transportation barrier is that food distribution sites often require drive-through. So families without cars are at a disadvantage. Additionally, in some rural areas where the bus isn't as consistent, families find it difficult to make it to meal distributions in the allotted amount of time that you have to come pick up your food. And of course, we know that food insecurity goes hand in hand with a lot of other economic issues, including housing insecurity, which is also a major issue here in Hawaii. It's a problem too when you're trying to deliver services and the family doesn't have a stable address. And then also a lack of a coordinated statewide plan on how to address food insecurity from a macro level all the way down to the micro level, both during COVID times and hopefully after. So I think that that's one area that we could try to address. So what can we do? Educate the public. Conducting an education campaign would help to hopefully reduce stigma and alert the public to available resources. Increase funding for some of these emergency solutions in times of disaster or crisis when we know that they're experiencing increased demand, and particularly when that disaster or crisis turns out to be ongoing. But we also need to stop relying on these emergency solutions to fix long-term problems. So we need to invest in long-term solutions. And there are a lot of different approaches we could take. Just a few examples. Funding programs that deliver services and food to people, meet them where they are, can help us reach people in hard to reach areas, particularly rural areas of the state. Additionally, universal free school meals would be helpful for reducing stigma for children who are on free or reduced price lunches. We already have this in some of our schools, so I think expanding it would help us, really try to make sure that no child is going hungry in the state. Investing in community-based food systems. So this refers to creating regional markets that reduce the distance traveled between the farmer and the consumer. So it keeps local food in the community. And one example of this is the Double Up Food Bucks program that just recently started. And basically it doubles every dollar in SNAP benefits spent on local healthy food. So you basically get an extra dollar for every dollar spent. And then from a macro level, just creating jobs that pay living wages. We know that low income as well as unemployment are related to food insecurity. So the more we're able to address these kind of larger issues, the more we can prevent food insecurity from being a problem in the first place. Some other suggestions, building a statewide coordination. So I think actually this webinar might be a good place to start, bringing people from across different sectors, government, business, the social services, researchers, bringing everyone who's interested and already working on this to the table to come up with an overarching plan, both for now and for in the future. Reducing barriers to services. So we know from our data that more people are in need than are receiving services. And so continuing to reduce barriers and bureaucratic hoops for folks to jump through would be a big step. And then finally, of course, I have to say this as a researcher, but I also think it's true. Investing in research and needs assessment. This quick study really only scratches the surface, and there's a lot more that we need to know, particularly about marginalized communities and what their specific needs are related to this issue. And we want to make sure that we're investing in evidence-based practices as well, and this will help us get there. So in conclusion, I want to say, and I really want to emphasize how much really effective work is being done. There are great things being done, really impressive work. And I think that with more robust funding and increased collaboration and a clear plan, I think that this work could really be expanded to meet the unfortunately ever expanding need. So with that, thank you. And I guess we'll turn it over to the audience for questions.
Aloha. Well, thank you so much, Anna and Wei. So insightful, so many insights. I learned a lot from this. I'm sure the audience did too. And I'm seeing a lot of questions coming in to get us started. And First, I want to respond to some of the questions that came up in the Q&A box to assure people that people are asking, okay, how can they get their hands on the study? And after this webinar, we've been working up to the last minute. We'll be posting the report itself online for this study. We will also be sending out the video. We are recording this video, but also already news outlets are asking to talk to our researchers. And so you will start to see articles coming out, news stories coming out. Please do stay tuned for that. So we will be, and you can always email me, conan@hawaii.edu. If you want to get a hold of anything, or you have questions, you want to get in touch with anybody, my last name, conan@hawaii.edu. I'd love to hear from you, and I'd love to help you. So, there's a number of questions that are coming up, and I think one that really struck me was, okay, so this is a national problem, food insecurity, but things are much harder here in Hawaii than I saw in the US. So, in the US, it was, significant, right? What was it, 33, 35%? But, we're up to 48% in the category of food insecure or very food insecure. So what's going on here in Hawaii? Of course, some of that is based on our economy. Some of it might be based on our ability to respond. But for the researchers, what do you think? Can somebody weigh in on that? Wei, how about you?
Yeah, so basically, Denise is right. So for the national level, right, we see a total of 37% of those families reported some kind of like food insecure problems. By comparison, in Hawaii, this percentage is as high as 44% across all the households in Hawaii. And for the families with children, we see this percentage becomes even higher, right? As high as 48%. So I can just speculate that one of the reasons might be the high employment in the state of Hawaii. We are, largely driven by tourism, right? And then right after the pandemic hit us, and our unemployment increased substantially by 10 times. So before the pandemic, the unemployment rate is approximately 2.4%. And after the pandemic, and this percentage becomes 22.3%. So this is probably one of the driving forces and really lead to the high percentage of food insecurity issues among families with children. And
yeah, I think you're really right there. And, as I think about it, these kind of, the unemployment hit people that aren't used to being in the social services system. These are working people. These are people that were used to being fully employed. And how do they even have access? What do they know? Jack, you wanted to weigh in on this too. What do you think?
Oh, I was just gonna say, I mean, Hawaii have been a little bit better than the mainland, and a lot of kind of food insecurity up to the pandemic, and now has eclipsed kind of the mainland numbers, not by a lot, but noticeably. And I think a lot of that has to do with, to Wei's point, that there's been, a high level of unemployment locally, but also just that so many people do live paycheck to paycheck. So there's a lot of kind of analyses that kind of present that people don't have a cushion here, and that's largely because of the high cost of living. So any sort of bumps in the economic road, it's easy to then fall under a kind of more impoverished state where you do need to have support services. So I think it's a fine line here, particularly, it's easy to fall under that kind of into that need category very quickly.
I mean, another question I'm seeing is that the economy really isn't even open today. And so do you foresee this being a persistent issue, or do you think we're going to see numbers coming down soon, given economic conditions?
I mean,
Yanya, do you? Oh, Omar? Omar, what do you think?
I was just going to say, I think that's what is very unique about the context of Hawaii, because even before the pandemic, as Wei and Jack just pointed out, a lot of people were already teetering on being financially insecure. And this actually goes up a very high level up the occupation ladder here, where people who have salaries of $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 still could be a paycheck or two away from eviction or any of these other kinds of things, just because, you know, rent and home ownership is such a hard thing to deal with. So now once you're slammed with the pandemic and with our economy really heavily reliant on tourism, this problem of food insecurity could drag out much longer than anticipated in Hawaii, given that so much of our economy is dependent on tourism and a lot of external factors. So trying to balance out like the food insecurity issue along with all the other issues that are attached to it, like reopening the economy. It's kind of like you have to dip in two different social problems and actually deal with them simultaneously. It's not that we should prioritize food insecurity over opening the economy. We really need to reimagine how we're going to address this issue with some new policies and different types of collaborative work.
Thank you, Omar. Okay, so Shannon Matson is asking a very interesting question, and speaking from a perspective of someone who has been organizing a food distribution for her low-income community, and she's surprised that there isn't more of a presence of the kapuna in your data as showing up as food insecure. What is, you know, is that truly correct? Because she's noticing, you know, that the 60-year-old and plus demographic doesn't have the same options of like WIC and school provision. Can you discuss this issue a little bit? Is the data correct, or is it just that they have fewer options?
So we actually focused on families with children because that was the area that people primarily wanted to understand what the kind of the impact of school closures were. And so that's where we started our kind of investigation. So the data is only reflecting those households that have children. So that's why you're not seeing as many kapuna. But I will say from the interviews that we conducted that was an issue, and it is, I think, going to be a big issue that we should definitely do some research into. I know that, you know, people are reporting that previously self-sufficient kapuna were now unable to do the grocery shopping for themselves and have become food insecure because of the pandemic. So I know that they are experiencing particular types of challenges, and like you mentioned, having different options when it comes to the benefits programs that address those issues. So I don't know if anybody else on the panel knows more about this and wants to jump in, but I think it's definitely an area that we should investigate.
Well, in addition to aging, some are asking about, you know, ethnicities. Is there any insights by ethnicities, especially one person asked about Native Hawaiian. Maybe there's other ways that this, maybe Pacific Islanders, are there other ways that there's special attention we should pay to certain communities here? In addition, aging and, you know, seniors, the kapuna. Yan, you've looked at this data closely. Maybe you have some insights on this.
Well, Native Hawaii and Pacific Islanders does have a low economic status, but the data we analyzed there and provided by CDC, they don't have the information for this particular question, but I believe there will be a large proportion that will be Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders. Especially we see the COVID infection case is very high among those people who I think Micronesian and minority ethnic, for example, are the Pacific Islanders. Anyone else can jump in, but so far I can answer.
Jack, do you have some anecdotal evidence on this?
No, I mean, I just say they're obviously correlates. I mean, of a lot of the things that we're already saying. So, you know, a lot of the marginalization factors that are associated with the lower income, less education, you know, other kind of societal factors. Those all kind of apply to the same, you know, to the same marginalized groups that oftentimes, unfortunately, are impacting Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. So I would suspect that, yeah, that I'm sure that those numbers are disproportionate, but unfortunately, probably consistent with some of the other data that we have seen.
So there's a number of questions coming in from different people that I'm actually the economist on this group, and I didn't participate in the study, but they deal with the fact that kind of the structure of our economy, that part of the reason we are hard hit is because we have a tourism economy, and when things went into lockdown, you know, our visitor sector, of course, was heavily hit, and that hurt many families that rely on that sector. Another issue that comes up is how local agriculture fits into this picture of food insecurity as well. And if there was, you know, are there sort of institutional things or policy things that we should be doing to prioritize local agriculture as a way to provide more healthy food options for this community, and what that might look like. Of course, these turn to the larger structural issues of our economy, but does anyone want to speak on some of these issues?
Yeah, I think it's important to, when we're thinking about the Hawaii context and addressing food needs and what we just discussed about particular racial and ethnic minority groups, it's not just about obviously getting them food, of course, but it's also about the types of food and the ways in which they get their food and grow their food and have certain types of food within their communities. That's also something that state institutions and other organizing bodies in Hawaii that needs to pay attention to, because with such a heavy reliance on imported food here, there also could be a serious lack of understanding on what types of foods are beneficial or detrimental to one's health, given that if you just look at the distribution of food outlets on the west side compared to the north side, compared to the south side of just this island alone, food resources aren't equitably distributed amongst different communities. And then of course, because of low income, you know, different racial ethnic minorities are then locked into certain types of residential areas where different types of food options just might not be available to them. And of course, adding on to the burden of transportation, getting better food into other locations is also an issue. So when it comes to dealing with that, it is a very multifaceted issue. And COVID, unfortunately, has unearthed a lot of these long-standing issues, but I think this is an opportunity to kind of address all of those things at once.
Jeff, Shanka, I'm wondering if you want to weigh in here. This was some of the questions you were asking me earlier, really about, you know, how much this food insecurity is driven by people not knowing, you know, about nutrition or not having access to nutritional food, which is also locally produced agriculture is really maybe not having those options. You might have some thoughts or some questions for this group.
Well, I haven't done any research, but I do know that we are the fast food society. So I do think that too many of us just don't eat well. And I think that better education regarding just eating better would lead to less food insecurity than exists today. And perhaps educating those who have limited funds to purchase food at a store would be able to purchase the right ones rather than perhaps what the kid wants to eat that evening for dinner. I just think some education may help in that regard.
Thank you. Thank you. So there's, well, I was going to turn to another question, but I'm also looking at Brad and you haven't talked yet. So Brad, I'm wondering what insights you want to offer at this point.
No, thanks. I was maybe more interested in a question for Anna and Wei. Maybe if you guys could jump in. there's so many great recommendations from you two and the rest of the group here. And at the risk of oversimplification, I'm wondering, outside of the sort of implementation barriers and those types of a variety of things, if you had a broad sweeping initiative, or if you had a magic wand and could actualize one big change, what would that one big change be? Big takeaway points for each of you. I'd love to hear that.
Thank you, Brad, for this great question. So if I have the magic wand, I think, I want to let the COVID-19 go away immediately and its impact get minimized. Because my big concern is that while COVID-19, itself and a lot of, social policies to deal with COVID-19 really has substantial social consequences for a lot of people in the state of Hawaii. So my own research and to look at mental health related to COVID-19 really indicate that, for a lot of people during the pandemic, their mental health greatly impacted by this, COVID pandemic, along with the social isolation and so forth. So I think really, if I have the magic wand, I really hope that COVID-19 will go away immediately and people will find jobs immediately, so that they have the money and they have the paycheck, and they can solve their food insecurity issues and the housing insecurity issues, right? Anna, you want to add?
Yeah, so I think if I could wave a magic wand, I would want to prevent food insecurity from being an issue in the first place, so that we're not having to remove barriers to services, that people just have what they need, which I think is kind of what Wei is talking about as well. So I would want to switch to a broader, more anti-poverty approach in general, and to address, all the myriad of issues that are related to economic struggle, from wages to having enough jobs, to being a sustainable community. So yeah, if I could dream big, that's what I would do. I know that's not practical. But that if I could just wave a magic wand, I would want to focus on prevention, because we know that food insecurity, as well as other issues like homelessness, they lead to poor outcomes in adulthood if they're experienced in childhood. And so if we can really prevent this, we could really be saving a lot of distress in the future. And I would also say that and this is kind of tying into what I think we were talking about just a minute ago, I would want for people, there are a lot of people doing really, really good work. And I think that they probably could answer, there's probably people who are audience members who could answer some of these questions better than we can. And so I would like to see more focus on kind of grassroots efforts as well.
Thank you, Anna and Wei. And okay, I'm just going to comment that Omar, you have some fans that they love what you're saying, so your name is coming out and you're getting applause in the Q&A. And I'm also noticing a number of people are calling for a more community response, a more whole of society response here. And their questions are raising from, okay, is the legislature interested in this? And Marielle Turboy has given a Senate Bill 1250. I haven't seen it, but so is the legislature interested in this? Probably yes. Are communities interested in coming together? Is this a whole of society effort that needs to happen? What do the researchers think? I think one thing to me that's exciting is that if we're having this conversation today and putting forward to you some of the initial research we could do, it would be for us very exciting to be that sort of evidence-based source of information that could help inform decision-making that will be at involve policy. It will involve the NGOs and their delivery, involve the business sector, employers. It does need to be a combined effort And to me, it would be tremendously exciting if we have a place at the table to help inform that with data. I'm curious of what the panel thinks, but especially the work that you did here today, is it the kind of thing that you think we should, and some are asking, what do you think we should do next in terms of research that could inform, if we did pull together this sort of more whole of society approach, what kind of research would you want to do that hasn't been presented today? This research, by the way, Jeff put this challenge to us. These folks did this research in the matter of, I think it was 4 to 6 weeks. So this was rapid, trying to get data to you. But if you could delve deeper, what would you do? I'll turn it over to Jack.
I'll just say, as far as, I mean, what needs to be better understood, and it's something that wasn't presented in this presentation today, is kind of how all of these issues related to poverty are interconnected. We have a patchwork of services. We have housing services that are independent of mental health services, which are independent of food insecurity services. And we don't look at the kind of holistically, both what's driving those things, because there's actually a common cause for a lot of those things, but also how we could prevent any of those sort of pitfalls from occurring. What we have found is people that are housing insecure also are experiencing mental health issues, that are also experiencing housing insecurity, that it's an incredibly high percentage that say that they won't be able to make their rent next month. People that are experiencing housing insecurity or food insecurity, which is related to housing insecurity. So how we can kind of connect services so that if you're applying for SNAP, you also get, benefits for housing services, and that you're provided and linked into these other services, and kind of a one-stop shop that hasn't been able to get off the ground.
Oh, thank you, Jack. Yan Yan, I'm wondering if you can weigh in on this or anything.
Sorry.
You have thoughts to share?
Well, I
put
think
you on the spot.
Racial ethnic specific research always focus on minority ethnic groups. They are most socially or economically disadvantaged.
That would be great. So like if you could do a further study, that would be the next move, is to really drill in on the data on some of these, by ethnicity and such. That would be what you would do next.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Omar.
Yeah, and in that regard, I know Civil B and other news outlets in Hawaii have already been covering this. And I just think this needs, and whenever possible, we need to continue to keep saying this. Given that Hawaii is one of, or if not the most racially, ethnically diverse state in the country, we very seriously need to have better data on the demographic profile of this state. So first and foremost, that means we should stop categorizing Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, or other Asian groups into one category. We really need to separate out this information, because we will then be able to have a much clearer picture of who's in need, where people are in need. And then of course, once diving into that type of information, the different types of, cultural practices and food habits and ways of living, all those things, we can actually address them more clearly and more accurately if we are targeting the specific communities that we need to be able to quote unquote track or count. It doesn't serve anyone any benefit if we're just lumping everyone into one category. It's nice to have statistical comparisons to the census and all that, but when we're talking about Hawaii and local issues in Hawaii,
I like that.
There's enough people data in the surveys to say, okay, we have this percentage of Filipinos, we have this percentage of Micronesians, we have this percentage of Tongans. Without that, it'll be very hard to make specific recommendations for certain communities.
Omar, I really like that, because we tend to base on national. We're trying to align with the national databases so we can understand how we're different, but we're unique in some ways that really require more attention, as you're noting. this, I think, is a little bit on us. So we should figure out as researchers what are the most appropriate categories. Also talk to others about that, because Jack is sort of alluding to this as well, that we need to sort of work across. We do one study for one particular issue, but these issues are actually intertwined, interlinked. And if all the studies could be using the kind of disaggregated data that Omar is talking about, that would really serve the community well. So I think this is on us to try to figure out, how do we get these databases talking to each other and also really suiting our communities here. Excellent, excellent points. Well, we're running close to the end of our time. And Jeff, I don't know if I can impose on you. Do you have any final comments you would like to make today?
Yeah, all I can say, Denise, is that this begins with raising awareness. So, I mean, community action starts with this kind of discussion. And I did have a chance to look at Senate Bill 1250. It does talk about establishing a fund for this very purpose. I would certainly appreciate any further movement on that bill forward. But no, a community response, I mean, we got thought leaders and stakeholders listening in today, and this is where it begins. So thank you and the panelists for all you've done.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Jeff. I do want to give a couple quick shout outs of thank you to my team that helped pull this together. Lisa Lee and Bernadette Baracchio have been really instrumental in bringing this together. And I'm here live at the Digital Studio. This is a new facility for learning and teaching here in Sinclair Library. And I'm in the virtual room. So this is where students can better learn how to Zoom and live stream. And I also want to give a shout out to the Hawaii Food Bank. I happen to be the coordinator for UH Manoa to try, so I want to encourage any UH listeners to contribute, but the community as well. As the researchers pointed out, the food bank and food pantries are the #1 source that people are getting food. And this year, as I understand it, they prefer cash. So do think about that. There's, also a bag of rice is great. They welcome all of those things, but cash is also very, very helpful. And they have great t-shirts this year. So do think about giving to the food bank. With that, I think we're closing in on the end of our time. I really thank you. If you like this series, please do write me, conan@hawaii.edu, or the email deancss@hawaii.edu. We would love to get your feedback and input. And I want to thank First Insurance Company of Hawaii, the Hawaii Business Roundtable, Chamber of Commerce, and all of you who joined us today. Mahalo. Thank you so much.